Born December 27, 1936, in a time when Great Depression and cultural imbalance for African Americans ran rampant in the United States, a human rights activist and icon was born. His name, Joseph Henry Beasley. Excelling in the public school system of Cincinnati, Ohio, it was during this phase of his life that he began to set high expectations and committed himself to a life of human service. He received his BS degree in criminal justice from Park College and attended graduate school at the Clark Atlanta University. Joseph Beasley is the former Southern Regional Director of the National Rainbow Push Coalition, founded by Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. Joseph Beasley, also president of African Ascension, an organization he formed to develop economic and political ties throughout Africa and the African diaspora, also served as a board member of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City, AfroNet in Lusaka, Zambia, AfroBrus in Sao Paulo, Brazil, Christ Institute in Atlanta, and is chairman of both the Benedita del Silva International Foundation and the Asian American Center. The bulk of his current work focuses on the unification of African descendants for economic, political, social, and cultural empowerment. He's received dozens of awards, 2 honorary doctorates, with even a library dedicated in his honor at the Zumbi dos Palmares College in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Featured in the New York Times, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and CNN, this revolutionary icon has set the bar on breaking down racial barriers and taking our world by storm. This Black History Month, we recognize the now Dr. Joseph Beasley for his tireless efforts, fearlessness, fortitude, and on being a true representation of what loving, living freely, and living bold really looks like. Mr. Beasley, how are you, sir?
I'm amazing.
I know that you recently had an accident a couple weeks ago, so it's really great to see you looking well and doing well. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very well, thank you.
Yeah, you look great.
Thank you very much.
As you know, we are here today to honor you and honor everything that you've been doing. The world should know about it and find out ways in which we can follow in those footsteps. So let's start.
Just listen to the introduction. It's almost just fantastic. But it's not been easy all the way.
Absolutely. And we want to talk about what that looks like. I think we're coming into a time where we are accepting the ebb and flow, the ups and downs. But that doesn't stop us from pushing towards the ultimate goal, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's start with your childhood.
Well, when you're born at a time in a society that is just one step beyond slavery. Of course, I grew up on a plantation about 40 miles south of here in Fayette County. During those times, my people were sharecroppers. And the sharecropper, you know, you could just, as a young child, you sense that your worth was not of much value because you had the white people that there's a different set of rules for them. And so I grew up during a time when I was finally able to go to school, and we had different months that we went to school. We went to school when we were not working.
Right.
We were not planting or harvesting. Otherwise, during those times, African people had to be in the field working. And really, there was a rule like if you're old enough to walk, you're old enough to work and do something.
So, to what age did you grow up on the plantation? What age did you leave?
Well, actually, we wanted to go in Fayette County at that time. African Americans could only go to the 7th grade, and I had a desire to go a little further. And of course, our option was, since we were working on the plantation, you had to slip away.
Right.
And finally, after being abused by the old overseer on the day before we left, and my sister and I, we'd already made the plans that we were taking a bus and heading to Atlanta the next day.
What were your parents like at this time? How did they, at a time like that, instill in you the know-how to want to push through, to want to drive through, even when the circle of living and day-to-day was so harsh? How did they instill?
Well, you know, my father had already left the South by then. My father was somewhat a very unusual man.
What do you mean by unusual?
Well, I mean, he had kind of like a blended family. My dad didn't really play by the rules in Fayette County, and the white people knew that Roy Beasley was a little different. And one of the things that he did on the side was to make moonshine. And so you're in the liquor business, and of course you had to pay off certain officials, etc.
Right.
But nonetheless, there was a number of times when he had not made sufficient coverage, and he actually went to prison.
Oh, wow.
And I guess the second time that he escaped from prison, he escaped from prison. So rather than going home and picking up his wife and 5 children, I was the youngest. He actually went and picked up his girlfriend and went to California. And so we 5 kids was left there with my mother, which made it even more hard, really, harder.
Absolutely. A single mother.
It's single mother.
And 5 children?
And 5 children.
5 children. Siblings, 2 boys? Or?
Well, yes, I'm the youngest. I had 3 older sisters and an older brother. And
so at that time, when did you realize then, at that age, in that time, that something is off balance about this living? This cannot be the norm and for the rest of my life. Did it start then, or was there an epiphany?
Well, you know, I've always been sensitive to events, and you know, I can go back and remember things like the day that the bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor, and I remember the day that Franklin Roosevelt died. These are moments that you remember, and of course, Franklin Roosevelt was the President of the United States when I was born, and his wife Eleanor was someone that we had a fondness to think about because she seemed to have been a fair woman. It was very unusual during those times. She worked with the Tuskegee Airmen and so forth. And then I guess a couple of years later, Eugene Talmadge died. Eugene Talmadge was the governor of Georgia at that time. And we had the radio, from time to time we'd have our live battery, and so we could play the radio, and every other word out of Eugene Talmadge's mouth was, we're going to keep the niggers in that place forever. So when we got the news that he had died, it was totally a different feeling than when I heard about FDR dying. I had a sense of relief and almost elation that this devil had gone out of the world.
Now, what prompted the desire to join the Air Force?
Well,
did you trust that you could possibly fight injustice on that level?
Well, you know, I think as things have happened in my life, it's been more like it just happened. We had not really pre-planned these things. But I guess the question you raised about what would give me the audacity to think that we could change our situation, given you know, the circumstances in 1936. I was able to read about the Haitian Revolution as a young boy. I was always interested in history, and when I read about how Napoleon Bonaparte, who was the strongest army in the world at the time, was defeated by the Haitian slaves. And of course, that gave me a sense that it is possible to change the situation. So I think that even now, that African people all over the world owe a great debt of gratitude to the Haitians because they really debunked the whole notion of white supremacy.
They were the first to set the example.
Absolutely. Up until that time, they got away with this notion that we've done the right thing by bringing these Africans out of Africa, and bring them to the West and give them some civilization. They had done us a favor. But when the Haitians rebelled, people are not pleased with their conditions. And in fact, that set in motion a series of events that changed the course of the Western world.
Absolutely. So your desire to, I guess, have that example of those that looked like you and decided to fight, was that the prompting to go into the Air Force?
We talked about me, leaving Georgia, leaving Fed County, and then for one semester, I attended school here in Atlanta at the Turner High School in the west part of Atlanta, which had some very interesting experiences there as well, human nature.
So a series of experiences was causing the wake up or the shake up.
As a country boy from Fed County, raggedy, and you're in now metropolitan Atlanta, and I remember one time that the teacher had made an example of me by saying, class, guess who got the best grade in science today? Joe Beasley. And if he can do it, you know that if you apply yourself, how well you can do.
The class predominantly made up of African Americans?
All African Americans. Of course, all the schools were still very segregated, and Turner High School was the second high school in Atlanta that accepted African people. Washington High was the first. And some of those dynamics are still being played out. The Washington High School is still there, and we still have students going there. And then we go on to the north side of Atlanta, and we got North Atlanta High School, which is like a Taj Mahal. Washington High still looked the same way it did when they built it.
What was the first act that you decided to get involved in, the first point of activism? Can you remember the first cause you decided to really say, you know what, I think I can get involved and I think I can support a change here? What was that first cause?
Well, as you probably know, there was a great debate when there was some talk about integrating the armed forces.
Yes.
Because the general thought was, what self-respecting white boy would sleep in a room with a nigger? And so I think I've always been able to cover the ground that I stand on. And I remember, one of the young recruits, same private like me, when we shared a room, white boy. And I remember one time he had his feet on my bed. And I think that was a real confrontation. That white boy, what are you thinking about? Disrespecting me in that manner. But
you were able to stand your ground without fear.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
And so when we left Georgia to go to Cincinnati, and to really the tenements of the North, and all of this is still playing out today. When we and many African people have never had a real home in the United States up until this day. And when we deal with problems like homelessness, some of this is a residue that came out of the first globalization. We talk a lot now that we're globalized everything, but this really is a second globalization.
You say a lot of this is playing out now. What do you think the main contributing factor is for social economic imbalance, not just within our community, but within our world today? What do you think the main contributing factor is?
Well, we live in a system of global capitalism.
Absolutely.
And as you probably know, was founded really on buying and trading and selling African slaves.
Yes.
That's the foundation of our system.
Yes.
And so now we talk about commodities, whatever it's wheat or whatever, but we used to be the commodity. We remember that. And I think to get some of the answers to these questions, we have to go back. And what is happening, of course, nobody really want to go back to find out what is the genesis of this. Now, I've spent time and I've went back.
That's good. I want to come back to that later. I'm going to ask you a question later. But
I went back and looked at some of the things that happened in history that set this in motion. And I think the one thing that I believe that points us to this separation that some have and some have not.
Have and have
And
nots.
have and have nots, yes. And it really occurred at the Vatican in Rome, where then Pope Alexander VI was sitting in Peter's spot, which is Peter's had followed Christ. And then popes after that have been so-called infallible in their notion of how things pertain to religion. But the Pope, Alexander VI, on the throne in 1493, in collusion with the monarchs of Europe, that came up with this notion of the doctrine of discovery. Now, the Europeans was restless, and they didn't know whether the world was flat or round, but they were bound and determined to find out.
I remember asking you once if you could change anything in history, what would it be? If you could change any cycle of events or any experience, what would it be? And your response was similar to what you're saying now in relation to exposure. What do you mean by that? If you could change anything in history, what would exposure?
Well, I believe that if we go back and see where the faults was broken, yes, and was there a conspiracy? And I think clearly there was a conspiracy with the monarchs of Europe, and of course back in those times Europe was white, and the monarchs of Europe, and then the Pope of Rome. And when the essence of this doctrine of discovery was, oh boys, go out and find whatever you find. If you find an island, if you find a continent, whatever you find, if the people are not Christians, then they're savages. And if they're savages, you can kill them.
Or enslave
You can convert them, enslave them, but nonetheless, take their property, take their land. And so a year earlier, Christopher Columbus had discovered so-called America, but of course he had actually wound up in Haiti, and Dominican Republic.
We know now. We didn't learn this in school, but we know that now. Yeah.
Well, and he really was, I think, under the influence. He couldn't drink it a little bit. He initially thought he was in India, which is quite a distance from the United States, but nonetheless, and I've been to the Vatican and have made issues of the fact that when the earthquake happened in 2010 in Haiti, when over 300,000 people died instantaneously because the infrastructure in Haiti is not very sturdy.
Yes.
Because when these Haitians defeated Napoleon, Thomas Jefferson was the president of the United States. And so he was not pleased with those events because at that time he owned slaves.
I want to go back to your point about Christianity and the doctrine of discovery, the development of how we live now, how we live day to day. It's based on Christianity. So enforcing the practice of or belief of Christianity on a people, forcing them to convert, and if not converting, then this is where we are today. This is the premises. That was the experience of where we are today. That's what caused this chain of events where we are today.
Well, it's tragic and it's appalling to say that so many people died in the name of Christ. But indigenous people did die, and this doctrine of discovery was finally codified into the United States Constitution in 1823. We were having disputes about with the Native people, Native Americans, was that the doctrine of discovery was really the guiding principles that would be followed. And so the Native people had their land taken, and many of them died, and then many are still on the reservations. And of course, this doctrine of discovery is still being played out, even as we speak. In North Dakota, we talk about the pipeline. And, President Obama had the sensitivity to stop the pipeline because the Native people, but as soon as Donald Trump entered the White House, it became full speed ahead.
They dishonored their own treaty.
Well, and that's, you know, about every treaty that we've ever made, we broke them. And so when we wind up today with Donald Trump in the White House, and we talk about the capitalistic system, you know, he's gotten all that money. I think it was left $200 million by his dad when he died. And you just imagine what an advantage if your parents leave you $200 million, and a lot of it's property, of course. Property was stolen property, quite frankly.
Absolutely.
And so I think as we go across the world, and I'm in Africa a lot now,
yes.
But when we go across the world and we recognize that the history of the United States, the history of even all of Africa, written by Europeans. And so until such time as we go back and really tell the story as it actually is, that I don't think we're going to bring any real sanity to our system.
Now, I want to say something that I've heard it popular across the board, mainly from African Americans. And the first time I heard it, it absolutely shocked me. And I want to know what your take is. Some African Americans believe that if it were not for slavery, that we wouldn't have the opportunities that we do today. What's your take on that?
Well, it really is just idiotic, quite frankly.
I agree.
I mean, human beings were born to be free.
Absolutely.
And, you know, that's why sometimes I hear people talking about, you know, these immigrants, or these, or even worse, you know, these aliens. You know, this is God's world. And he made it, and I consider myself not a citizen of the United States. I'm a citizen of the world.
Man.
And so therefore, when I go to places like, I was just recently in South America and Colombia, there's one thing a lot of people have not taken into account is that we're not the only Africans that served as slaves in the Americas. I think so time as we really get that clear in our heads, then we're going to be, you know, kind of Christian and Dixie.
Across the board.
Yeah, because most of the slaves, as history would report, most of the slaves went to Brazil. And so it was easy for the so-called Europeans to navigate into Brazil and South America, where it's more difficult to navigate into North America. I think one thing that some people don't really understand, I was just reading this morning, I'm making my plans to be in Cuba on May 1st, May Day, and I would urge many of our brothers and sisters to consider going into Cuba.
So what's happening in May Day?
Well, you know, it's the celebration of workers. And this whole notion of Cuba and how, you know, we've had this 60-year fight with Cuba is totally out of joint.
Now, you spend a lot of time out of the country. Let's talk about some of your international relations as far as Brazil, as far as Africa, Somaliland. What exactly is going on in these places that the world ought to know about and should get involved in? Well,
you know, I guess we were very much involved in the struggle to free South Africa from apartheid.
Yes.
And Nelson Mandela, a young lawyer that was fighting for his rights, being incarcerated,
yes,
and spent actually 27 years in prison. And of course, those of us here in the United States are Pan-Africanists. And the Pan-Africanists would suggest that in Africa, wherever you are in the world, we're one people.
Absolutely.
And once we get this concept kind of straight in our heads, then we can begin to understand some of these, you know, black, white, some of these other issues. But anyway, I got involved in South Africa around disinvestment from South Africa. Because we wanted to end white rule in South Africa. The situation was, of course, that 5,000 white people, with the support of the white world in general, was controlling over 30 million black people. Now, it's been my experience in talking to Africans from throughout the continent. It always was that we had welcomed these people to come. And we it gave them a seat at the table.
Yeah.
But then they decided they won't take everything. They pushed us, into the Bantu stands like in South Africa. And so with much of the spotlight being on South Africa, and finally with the release of Nelson Mandela. And then, of course, Nelson Mandela came here to the United States, and we were very engaged. My pastor, that Cameron Alexander from the Antioch Church, one of the leading churches, we had brought Mr. Mandela into Atlanta to raise money to return to South Africa to run for president of South Africa. So not only, was Atlanta stopped, but of course, most other major cities in the United States welcomed Mandela, except, and I was shocked, quite frankly, I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked because he was not welcome in Miami. I think this notion that the enemies of the United States need to be the enemy of black people is stupid. And I really appreciated Mandela almost nearing the end of his life.
Powerful.
When he said that, he don't turn his back on his friends. They wanted him not to embrace Castro. And so, but when Castro overthrew Batista and took over power in Cuba, and he did it with the help of the United States. And so, but any Cuban that could get to Miami would be, was welcome.
Yeah.
These immigrants coming from Cuba, they had enough numbers to take over the government in Miami. And these are people that's been used to having black people take care of them. First thing that got me involved in traveling, I've been to Haiti probably 30 plus times. And of course, it's still the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And of course that's the case because it have two of the most powerful enemies in the world, and number one being the United States. And so we Thomas Jefferson put an embargo on Cuba. It's not really been lifted yet. And we were hoping that Mr. Obama would expose some of this, but that hasn't happened. Now you talk about some of the others. So I went to South Africa. I joined the ANC, African National Congress, and we stayed in South Africa to help motivate voters to come out to the polls and vote for Mandela. And of course, in much of Africa and the United States have been so idealized in the media. There's this notion that even if you're an African in the United States, you must be rich. And so it's a drawing card just to have.
That's a serious belief.
So there's a drawing card to just for the South Africa to say that, well, we understand some of the African Americans going to be in the delegation. So they came to see not only Mr. Mandela here, but they also came to see what they was curious about these African Americans that had left the United States to come to South Africa to support them.
You're doing some work with Coca-Cola, working closely on the board of Coca-Cola, doing some work. Is this in the Congo?
Well, Coca-Cola is the most identifiable brand across the world.
Yes.
And it's almost like it's intoxicating to see a Coca-Cola being poured, and so Coca-Cola is global.
Yeah.
I think the only country that don't have a Coca-Cola is Cuba. But it's all over the world, and it's the number one brand, but most of the Coca-Cola bottling companies are owned by white people, and so throughout the continent of Africa, the Africans are drinking it just for the thrill of it, and I think it's not right, not fair, not even possible in the age of information that would continue, and so we alerted Coke. And of course, there's been these push and tug in the civil rights movement and so forth, but there's been this notion that, we believe in reciprocity.
Absolutely.
If I support you, then it just makes sense for you to support me. And so if we're going to drink Coca-Cola, because we do have options, you do have a Pepsi or whatever the case may be, but I guess we've been challenging Coca-Cola. That's probably a better word. We've been challenging Coca-Cola since the early 80s to kind of get your act together.
What exactly is Coca-Cola not doing that they should be doing?
Well, you know, in the early 80s here in the United States, when we had African Americans now assembling money, some of our athletes and some of our entertainers had money, and they could afford to purchase a bottling company because they had franchised Coca-Cola. And the answer was really when African American early was trying to buy Coca-Cola franchise, well, we don't sell Coca-Cola to niggers. What do you mean? And at the headquarters, of course, we've had a number of battles. I guess the last battle we had with Coca-Cola was probably 1992.
Now this was actually said. This was actually.
Well, that was the essence of it, and I think that in the notion of being realistic, you know, we know what it means when you say no. We got the money. Why can't we get it? Coca-Cola decided that we're going to be inclusive. We don't have any other choice but include black people as
so
equal
not that we wanted
opportunity.
to, but we don't have a choice.
Well, we have a choice, and so they formed an organization they call Coca-Cola Enterprises. And it's quite interesting that the Coca-Cola Enterprises actually bought back the rogue owners that refused to follow affirmative action and equal opportunity. Coca-Cola bought them back, took the franchises away from them. And that's why I have this love-hate thing with Coke, and because Coke has proven that if they're pushed to the brink, they would prefer, to get money rather than have a fight.
It always seems to be about the dollar. You sit on countless boards with Coca-Cola. You sit on a board alongside Warren Buffett.
Well, no, I'm not on the board. I go in and raise hell in the board meetings. There's no way that Coca-Cola
so you're not sitting on the board. You go in.
Yeah. So and normally because he's a lot more trained than I. Jesse Jackson, as you know, I worked with Jesse for 40 years, and usually it's Jesse that is rocking the boat, but we're right there with him, and push come to a shove, if you have to really be a bull in a china closet, I don't mind doing it if necessary.
So, your circle of competence in working or having to confront Coca-Cola about the work conditions, what exactly is going on with the work conditions in the bottling plants?
I think as a multinational corporation, which Coca-Cola is, and one of the things, the multinationals really have more power than governments. So I think as we struggle and get our unity amongst black people all over the globe, and if we can somehow move beyond nationalism and move beyond tribalism and understand that if you happen to be an African black person, for whatever reason, we've been picked out to be picked on for at least the last 500 years. And so if you're here in Atlanta and you're from South Africa, some Congo, and I have, Africans at my home all the time. But if you got that beautiful black skin, if you get caught up in one of these racial profiling roadblocks, they don't know whether you care whether you're from Zimbabwe or whether you're from Cameroon or whether you're from Vine City. You're just here in Africa. And I think if we understand, if you're in the Western world, anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the United States, except North South America, color means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. What efforts do you think we've been able to make so far, as far as your efforts with Coca-Cola and is it Brazil?
Yeah, I think the last major confrontation we had with Coca-Cola was, I believe it was maybe it's been 10, 15 years ago, when we found out that Coca-Cola was paying black people $20,000, on the average $26,000 less than they were paying their counterparts doing the same job at the headquarters. And most of that information was fed into my office. My office, as you may know, for many years was at the Antioch Baptist Church, which is just down the street from Coke. We got a young lawyer named Cyrus Mary out of New York City. He took the case and ultimately won the case, and there was a $192 million judgment against Coca-Cola for the discrimination. And then, just...
How long did the case go for before you got to?
Well, it was a number of years,
so it doesn't happen overnight. Pushing past these type of barriers isn't overnight.
It doesn't happen overnight. I started going into Brazil. I've been on a list, I guess, for the last 20 years so, that the United States have a program where they bring in so-called emerging leaders from all over the world. They bring them here, and then they take them to meet certain people in each city. And if someone is interested in affirmative action, civil rights, human rights, even religion, they're routed my way. And so when I first got deeply involved in Brazil, it was through the State Department. These two young black twins from São Paulo, Brazil, came to my office, and they were extremely interested in affirmative action, and they wanted me to get them whatever I could pertaining to equal opportunity. And of course, from that, we just developed a relationship with an organization called Alpha Bras in São Paulo. And yes, São Paulo, Brazil. And so they then started to invite me to come. And I started going to Brazil twice a year. I would go on May the 13th, which is the Emancipation Day. And then I would go back on November 20th, which is Black Pride Day. They don't have a month down there yet. But so then, of course, I recognize that all the multinational corporations that's present here in the United States are also in Brazil.
Yes.
And so when we got the statistics, and these young black ladies from Brazil already had the facts that 53% of all the Coca-Cola that was made in Brazil was being consumed by African descendants.
Absolutely.
But they couldn't...
Being the major consumers, but not being able to reap any of the benefits or invest. It was
the same situation we had here.
Absolutely.
And of course, they were emancipated from slavery like 25 years after we were emancipated. While we were slaves in this country for 246 years, the African in Brazil were slaves for 500 years. They didn't want to let go.
Through the Joseph Beasley Foundation, you're able to tackle a lot of issues. You talked about from religion to injustice. Is there ever a point where you feel that you are unable to stretch yourself so thin because of all of the fights on many different levels, across all of the levels of injustice? Do you ever feel that you have to turn things down or turn away because of so much to...
Well, that's one of the limiting factors is money.
Right.
And this is something that I have going with the board, my board. They want me to narrow it down to one or two issues that we would focus on. But I would suggest that, all of these issues are coming at us, and we've got to find a way to address them. If it's in the same rubric, same area, why not try to address it?
Where would be the first place to begin to address some of these issues for those that may be interested in joining in the fight or being the change we want to see? What would be the first step? What would you suggest the first step to be?
Well, I think just being interested. A lot of people enjoy being ignorant. And I think the saying that ignorance is bliss is, it's pretty comfortable. I don't have to challenge myself, because if you get into this work, you have to be willing to put yourself on the line. And of course, when we go back and look at the civil rights struggle here in the United States, I, of course, am retired Air Force, and so during the civil rights movement here in the U.S., I was all over the world, but we had the same thing going on. But I remember the day that Martin Luther King was killed on April the 4th in 1968. I had just returned that same day to Atlanta from Vietnam in a war that we shouldn't have been engaged in because it was war of liberation.
I agree.
And so I kind of rededicated myself, even though I had no number of years to stay in the Air Force. We kind of rededicated. We will get involved in this struggle full time when we retire from the military. So that was my plan.
Yes.
And what I say to young people all the time, you know, decide what you want to do and do it. And when I decided I was going to, and I'd watch the personalities. I saw, you know, Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy and Andy Young and going down the line. But it was my mind that I wanted to work with Jesse Jackson because I thought he was the most credible. And so that I set that plan. It just so happened that I guess 2 years, 1956, when I was retired, getting ready to retire from the Air Force in '78. In '76, Jesse Jackson came to Kansas City, Missouri. He was trying to open a chapter of Rainbow Push. I mean, it was just Push, Operation Push in Kansas City. And so my wife knew Jesse Jackson and stuff. And so when he called that organizing meeting, we went to the meeting. And so we got on the board of organizing for Kansas City chapter of Operation Push. And
how powerful is that you set the plan?
Well,
and somehow the universe conspired, and he was able to come exactly where you were. That was your plan. You set
well, again, you know, when at that first meeting, planning meeting, I said, I'm going to need a job in 2 years, but I'll be retiring from the Air Force.
Right.
So this is going to be my job. And so we worked to build the chapter to the extent by 1978 they could had grown to the point that they needed an executive director. And of course, that was me.
Wow. Now, earlier you mentioned being able to have a plan, sticking to it, going for it, getting involved, being interested. Was there ever a time that, because you're a man that holds nothing back, you go full throttle, was there ever a time that this seemed to interfere with your personal life? Fighting so many different, on so many different levels, did it ever interfere with your personal life or get in the way of your fatherhood? Or? Well,
you know, when I get into something, I'm all in.
Yes, you are.
And of course, I have children, I have a wife, and my wife always an activist as well. But then I go full throttle. And at some point, maybe that, you know, well, aren't you at home or whatever?
Right.
Following Jesse Jackson.
But it was a bigger calling.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think if we don't need lukewarm people, even we go back to the Bible, and if you go to, I think it's the Revelations, and it talks about God, you know, and lukewarm people. I spew you out of my mouth. You need to be hot or cold.
Choose.
And I'm planning on, even 81, I want the thermostat up.
Love it. I love it. I love it. Now, 3 children. We know your wife has transcended on to her next journey. 2 boys, 1 girl?
Yes, yes.
Did they, at some point, or even now, decide to follow in your footsteps of advocacy?
Well, I have, you know, my daughter is the oldest, Sanjanetta, so we named her after her mother, Susanna. And then the twin boys were born in 1966, and they're identical twins,
yes.
but they're very different. They look alike in appearance, but the temperament is different. And both of them are extremely successful. I'm very proud of both of them.
Doctors?
Well, one is a medical doctor, and he's have a practice in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then his brother is over workforce development for Southern Florida. And I was proud to see there was not a scandal, but some people were kind of amazed that the director of workforce is making more than the mayor of Miami. So they're doing quite well.
They're doing quite well.
Yeah.
And as far as advocacy work, any activism work?
Well, the doctor is he's a great doctor. And I don't know whether you know this or not. They rate doctors like they rate hotels.
Oh, yeah.
Mine is a 5-star doctor.
Ah.
So he's all in medicine. So, you know, we have, you know, many grandchildren. I think I got about 15 grandchildren.
15 grandchildren.
And about 15 greats, I think. And I don't try to keep up with them by name, you know, so when I'm with them, you know, I just tell the parents, tell me who it is. You know,
Yeah. Now, last year was your 80th birthday celebration, as well as receiving an honorary doctorate. A lot of your family members were there. A lot of your grandchildren. Were they in attendance, your great-grandchildren as well? The room was crowded.
Yeah, well, I was, you know, happy, of course, that someone thought it well that we would have this celebration. And one of my grandsons did speak on behalf of the family. In fact, my stepmother, that I mentioned that my dad picked up.
Yes. You're very close to her.
We became very close, and she just passed. She made a transition last week,
Sorry to hear
and she was 100, almost 100.
She lived a full life.
Oh, absolutely. A good life, yeah.
When we think about circle of competence, this is a term that's coined by Warren Buffett, meaning pretty much to stay within what you believe to be true, to be honest, to be authentic of who you are. What would be your phrase? What would be your go-to memento of how you operate, how you think, how you believe, and what sets your integrity and your standards?
Well, I believe that, you know, that all human beings are a part of God's creation, which would mean that you're very precious. And so regardless of whatever geographics where you were born, whether it's in Asia, whether you're in Africa, in Europe, those are circumstances that we had no control over. But we do know that we are precious because, you know, if you look at this idea how, you know, if you become fertile in your mother's womb, how many other possibilities was there. But somehow you were selected to become a part of life's journey. And so I think that, you know, that people are precious. And I think if we don't let anybody marginalize us. And so what I would say to young people, if some people go, you missed the civil rights movement. No, you haven't. It's just starting. And one thing I've been really, you know, urging, I talked to Al Sharpton probably a couple of weeks ago, and we're supposed to get together sometime when he's in Atlanta. And Reverend Jackson has gone to Brazil with me on several occasions. Of course, Jesse's all over the globe.
Right.
But I believe that African Americans in general, instead of us going back to Washington every year, we've been going now for 50 years. And they've memorized Dr. King's dream, I have a dream, whatever, and so they challenge in the United States. But it's not just the United States, it's the world.
It's the world, absolutely.
And so what I would urge those of us that love liberty and believe it's doable, rather than, you know, that put it in a global frame.
Absolutely.
We live in a very small world. I mean, we could wake up in Atlanta, and we do have direct flights from Atlanta to the continent of Africa now. And I think
now that is a huge one. That's a huge
well,
one.
you know, so rather than saying I'm going to Paris, say I'm going to Dakar, Senegal. and you have an opportunity to go Ray's Island.
Absolutely.
And see where, see where, you know, our ancestors were put in shackles and marched up, sometime up to 1,000 miles to these ports of debarkation like Cape Coast, Ghana, or Goree Island, and Senegal. It's a damnable situation. And so this situation is still very open. We don't have, you know, Justice Act. Our government just shut down one of the questions about immigration.
Yes.
And matter of fact, I've gone to jail here in Atlanta with the Dreamers. And I had a call.
Now tell us about that experience. You were arrested during some...
Yeah, well, you know, again, the Dreamers are young people, as you know, brought to this country when they were small kids, with no control over.
Yes, their parents probably know where they were.
Absolutely, and because of looking for a better life.
Absolutely.
And many of them, you know, graduated top of their class. So I had a call from the young Dreamers and saying that they were going to confront the regents about that stupid rule, and they wanted to know if I'd be willing to go to jail with them. And I said, I would be more than delighted.
This is an outrage. People who've been here all of their lives at risk for being deported because they...
Well, it's crazy. I mean, it's insanity. And then insult the whole continent of Africa.
Right.
And that's not right. That's damnable. So I believe the fight is just getting started, and it's global in nature.
Absolutely.
And if you have fear flying, let me give you the caution that it's safer. That's the safest mode of travel is by airplane. It's more people were killed last year falling off donkeys than they did flying an airplane.
So that should be a reason to hold you back.
But no reason whatsoever. Jump on the plane and enjoy yourself, but understand you're in the struggle.
Absolutely.
I mentioned nationalism, tribalism. Well, I think what we need in the world is the unity of African people. Now, there's no reason for whites to get afraid because we're not savages. We understand that human beings are human beings. Well, you know, some people get nervous because these black people are organizing. but we're not savages. We understand humanity. We're not going to do what you did. We're not going to do to you what you've done to us. We have some humanity. So unity, I think, is a thing that, and the lines are drawn. The fight is just getting started. And it's a global struggle. We didn't pick this. And, you know, some of my closest friends, I can say this without fear of contradiction, some of my closest friends are white people. And so many white people, if they say, brother, we're going to hell together. We have to die and go to hell together. We'll do that. That's pretty strong words. But, and of course, some of the things like Christianity and what, you know, I'm a deacon in a Christian church. And, you know, there's a lot of great philosophers out here, but I'm too close now I can raise questions, but that doesn't mean, you know, we need to reject some of the things that might be better in the form of fairy tale. You know, I've been to the Congo 3 times over the last 15 months. And the Congo, of course, is the richest spot on the planet. We have more wealth in the Democratic Republic on the planet. We have more wealth in Congo than all of Europe and the United States combined, just in the Congo. With all the stealing that's been going on by the Western world, the wealth is still there.
Wealth as far as natural resources?
Natural resources,
water.
Absolutely. And, you know, all of the minerals that's used to fuel the economy of the world going forward, all the way in Africa. And so Africa, with the richest continent, with the poorest people, there's something that's damnably wrong with that. And I think that we have to set out to set it straight. And we need to rewrite history, not only the United States, but African history was written by Europeans. And actually, instead of, you know, glamorizing our past, which has been terribly ugly,
Absolutely.
and to put people the indignity of where I was born on a plantation is a damnable situation that shouldn't be tolerated. Well, we can't change history. And history is global in nature. It's not national. It's not, you know, it's global. We can't ignore the past. I'm not saying that we, you know, just labor in the past, but reality is reality. You know, we were child slaves. It was somebody else's property.
That is the fact.
That's the reality. And when we finally was emancipated from serving 246 years free in this country, we weren't given a damn thing. And they talked about 40 acres and a mule, but we never got it.
Never got it.
And so therefore,
reparations still never got it.
and when we look at you know, Bankhead and Buckhead, they're real.
Absolutely.
And what I'm saying to any person that you know, saying, well, I was not involved in slavery, what put me into that? If you still got the money, and if you still got the land, let's get the money and the land straight, and then we'll move on from there.
I love it. I love it. Anything you want to leave to say to those that are watching and will be watching this interview?
Well, I guess the thing that, you know, even at 81, I'm extremely encouraged. And because I believe that, you know, anything is possible. And, you know, set your hand to it. If you're wrong, and, you know, white people in the Western world have been wrong. And so many of them, and they're scared to death. They say that a guilty conscience needs no accusing. And if you as a people stand accused, and you're guilty. But if you've suffered, I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King had said that unmerited suffering is redemptive, which means if you had to suffer and you didn't deserve it, it accrues to you power. And so I think that so many African Americans don't have any money in the bank, but they got a lot of moral authority and power because of our suffering. And so we're just saying,
To
you know,
use that as your power and as your
well, that's real power.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Joe, it's been such an honor sitting here with you and having this conversation with you, this heart to heart. For more information, you can visit www.joebeasleyfoundation.org. For more information on you as well, joebeasleyfoundation.org.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of it's there. You know, we're limited because we don't have a whole lot of money, but that we don't let that, you know, stop us, because we're going to change Brazil. We got 120 million black people in Brazil, most of them living like dogs. And even personal sacrifice of myself, we've moved our attorney, Dick Freeman is his name, from Atlanta to Salvador. And we're going to get in there and for a long haul in Brazil and in Colombia and other parts of the Americas. And of course, you know, there's a great cry now amongst people throughout the Caribbean, and most of them are black. Most of these islands are black, for reparations. And it's a simple process, and it's accepted. If you've damaged something, fix it.
Absolutely.
Repair it. And so the notion that reparation will never get, you'll never get them if you don't ask for them, don't demand them. And we're still demanding them. So
Powerful.
thank you very much.
Powerful. And we can find out more information about getting involved, joining in on some of the initiatives on the joebeasleyfoundation.org.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.